In the year 2000, in the run-up to the presidential election year, that year, 2000, the state of Florida undertook a massive purge of the state's voter rolls. It was led by candidate George W. Bush's brother, Florida's Republican governor that year, and by Florida's Republican Secretary of State, Katherine Harris. The stated goal of the Florida voter purge was to make sure that felons who had lost their right to vote in Florida would not be permitted to vote by mistake in that year's election. The goal was to remove those ineligible names from the voter registration lists. Here's how that went. Early in the year, the private company that Florida contracted to purge its voter registration rolls gave state officials a list, supposedly, of 8,000 ex-felons to remove from the voter rolls. Not a single one of those 8,000 voters had actually been convicted of felonies, only misdemeanors. So legally, they were people who could still vote. But lists based on that, lists like that, were nevertheless used all over Florida as part of how they came up with the big purge list. So in Duval County, Florida, for example, more than half of the voters on a list of probable felons to be purged from the voter rolls were not, in fact, felons. In Clay County, Florida, 71% of the voters on a list of ineligible felons should not have been on that list. In Leon County, Florida, the only county in the state to independently research every name on its purge list, they were only able to verify that 5% of the voters they were told to scrub off their registration sheets actually had criminal records. In all, under the leadership of George W. Bush's brother, the governor, Florida officials targeted 173,000 names for removal from the state's voter rolls ahead of the 2000 election. Democrats argued at the time that the list disproportionately affected African-American voters who were voting for Al Gore in that election at a rate of about 90%. George W. Bush won the state of Florida in the final vote count by 537 votes. And that is what gave us, as a country, President George W. Bush. A 537-vote margin in a state that had just implemented a really sketchy purge of more than 170,000 people off its voter rolls. Now here we are in another election year. And hey, right on time, Florida Republicans are purging voter rolls in the state again. Florida's Republican governor, Rick Scott, has started a push this election cycle to remove potential non-citizens from Florida's voter registration rolls. Over the last several weeks, the state sent local election supervisors a list of more than 2,600 registered voters who they said are not U.S. citizens and therefore are not eligible to vote. The Associated Press reports that local election supervisors have responded warily to the list and have already pointed out inaccuracies. One county election supervisor, a Republican, tweeted this photo of himself with a real live U.S. citizen and registered Florida voter who was incorrectly targeted by the state of Florida as a non-citizen. See, the voter is the guy on the left there holding up his passport. That's his U.S. passport. He is a citizen. He was purged from the rolls. The folks at Think Progress have been writing up the stories of other U.S. citizens wrongly targeted by this year's voter roll purge in Florida, like Maureen Russo, who was born in Akron, Ohio, who's operated a dog boarding and grooming business in Florida for the last 4 decades. Nonetheless, Ms. Russo got this letter in the mail telling her, quote, the Broward County Supervisor of Elections Office has received information from the state of Florida that you're not a United States citizen. If you believe this information is false, you may request a hearing with the Supervisor of Elections for the purpose of providing proof that you are, in fact, a United States citizen. So the state of Florida is essentially saying to this woman, Ms. Russo, papers, please. If she doesn't prove that she is a citizen, the state is going to take away her right to vote. Why? Who knows? There's also this gentleman. His name is Bill Internicola. He is a 91-year-old World War II veteran. He was born in Brooklyn. He earned a Bronze Star for bravery in the Battle of the Bulge. He has lived in Florida for 14 years now. He has never had trouble voting. But now, this year, the state of Florida is demanding that he prove his citizenship in order to maintain his right to vote.
I have voted here for the last almost 15 years, right here. And I voted in Brooklyn when I lived in Brooklyn, and I really don't understand it. It's to me, it's like an insult.
As it happens, there is a pattern emerging among the Florida voters the state is trying to remove from the voter rolls this election year. The Miami Herald has been studying the Purge list. They have found, quote, Hispanic, Democratic, and independent-minded voters are the most likely to be targeted by the state's Purge. Only 13% of the potential non-citizen list is white, even though 68% of Florida voters are white. Not to put too fine a point on it, but the big voter purge going on in Florida right now, in addition to being just riddled with flat-out errors, is disproportionately targeting at least two groups that are shaping up to be key constituencies for President Obama in this year's presidential race. Democrats, obviously, and Latinos, among whom President Obama currently holds a 34-point nationwide lead. That's who's being purged from Florida's voter rolls right now, from the state that gave us a 537-vote margin of victory in the year 2000 and is now trying to revoke voting rights from thousands of mostly Latinos, Democrats, and independents ahead of this year's election. What could possibly go wrong? Joining us now is Michael Waldman. He's president of the Brennan Center for Justice at NYU School of Law. Mr. Waldman, thanks very much for your time. It's nice to have you here.
Great to be with you.
Having studied voting rights cases all around the country and over time, what do you think is the motivation for what's going on in Florida right now, and what do you think is its most likely outcome?
Well, you know, it is true that for election fiasco buffs, the question always is, what's going to be the next Florida? And the answer turns out to be, what do you know, Florida. This comes on top of many, many other problems with the way we run elections and things that have sought to kick people off the rolls or make it harder for people to vote. The problem with this kind of massive purge, and as you said, it's 180,000 people. When you do something like this close to the election, and you do it in secret, and you do it without double checking, there is no choice but to have errors, to have legitimate people kicked off the rolls. And, you know, it's kind of a microcosm of the many problems with the way we elect people. Look, nobody wants people to be voting who shouldn't be able to vote, but this is not a way to run a railroad. This is not the way to make our elections secure and safe.
I think you note that important point about the timing on this. It's so close to the election, and it's by a process where these problems don't seem to be able to be headed off before they're effectuated, before people are actually told you're not going to be able to vote, or they're at least intimidated from trying. Given that, given the way that this is essentially running right up toward the election, is there a way to stop this sort of thing? Is there a way to fix it?
Well, I mean, there is one way, which is that the Justice Department, which has the obligation to pre-clear things under Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, could look at this and say that this affects the voting rights of minorities. But it's public opinion, public attention, and the reaction of local officials, some of whom you showed, who are not in this really to make partisan points, but are just trying to do a very difficult job of running elections. Those kind of pushbacks can make a difference. And already the state of Florida just recently said, you know, maybe we ought to double check this before we start purging people. So the more people yell, maybe the more of an impact it'll have. But, Rachel, the real answer is, once we're done with the partisan shenanigans, which we're seeing in Florida so much this year and elsewhere, we really ought to modernize our voter registration system. If we put aside these fights and said, you know, let's make sure that everybody who's eligible to vote, that the government has an obligation to put them on the rolls and keep them there, and use computer records instead of these paper records, that's the kind of thing that could add tens of millions of people to the rolls nationwide and curb fraud for people who are worried about fraud. Because, you know, Mickey Mouse doesn't have a Social Security number, even in Orlando, where he lives. So, you know, we could get past this easily, but this does look like little more than, it raises a lot of questions, at the very least, about whether it's politically motivated.
That type of reform would imply that people both want people to be able to vote and don't want to be able to game the system by selectively purging people who might vote against their chosen candidates. And that is something that I'm nowhere near getting over in terms of that being an assumption here. Michael Waldman, the president of the Brennan Center for Justice, we consult your work a lot in terms of trying to understand the context for these voting changes that have come up so frequently in the last couple of years. Thanks for your work at the Brennan Center. Thanks for joining us here tonight.
Thank you.
Thanks. All right.